Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope those of you who were just at our Bay Delta meeting had a nice little break. And those who are maybe joining us for the first time, welcome. We're happy to have you. We are going to do a virtual tour of the Paradise Cut expansion and South Delta restoration project. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into kind of what that is and what that looks like. But before we get too deep into it, let's do a few housekeeping things. First and foremost, this is a Zoom webinar. And so what that means is you will not see all of the icons for all of the attendees like you maybe would in a meeting. So just keep that in mind. You'll just be seeing the information that we push out to you. We encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like. And the way that you do that is through the Q&A function on Zoom. So you'll see two little boxes and it says Q&A. So if you submit any questions through that box, I will ask those of John after we go through each of the segments of our virtual tour. So feel free to send those in anytime that you need to. Other than that, just letting you know that this will be recorded and it'll be available to you on YouTube afterwards, and we'll send out a link to those who would like to have that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. John Herrick. He grew up in a farming family in Lodi, graduated from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, served in the Navy. Thank you for your service. Graduated from McGeorge School of Law and has been practicing law for 34 years, 28 of which have been as general counsel for the South Delta Water Agency. Thank you for being here with us today, John. We certainly appreciate it. We're going to take a few minutes to do the tour that was generously supported by the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. So thank you so much. And I will let you give us an introduction of the project and kind of talk to us about where we are, where we've been, and how we're going to get there.
Thank you, Krista. As you said, I'm John Herrick. I'm the attorney and manager of South Delta Water Agency. Before anybody gets too impressed, South Delta doesn't provide water to anybody. We don't own anything. And I spend my entire life arguing with the state and federal government. So it's not the most glamorous or prestigious job. I'm also a member of the San Joaquin County Resource Conservation District. And so in that capacity, I've been intimately involved in the development of this project for many years now. I'd like to thank a number of organizations, including the RCD, especially American Rivers and South Delta Water Agency. There's an entity called SJCRCD, which we'll get to later. And then RD, Reclamation District 2062, which is the River Islands Development. The reason I want to thank those are that RCD and American Rivers are the ones that were able to keep this, the idea of this project moving forward, and especially American Rivers, which has invested lots of time and effort into not only the background, but the development of the specifics of the Paradise Cut expansion portion of the project. RD 2062, the River Islands Development, has been very helpful because much of the frontage on Paradise Cut is within their district, and they've graciously allowed us access onto the levees when we needed to either investigate things or do tours. So I'm very happy that they're part of this process. And also they've contributed money along the way to the various studies and modeling. The South Delta is an integral part of the state's water system, although it's not really well known by most people. And it's important because both the state and federal projects have their export pumps located in the South Delta. So all the water that's distributed to both the state and federal contractors, south and I guess west of us, all comes through the Delta. So that makes the South Delta extremely important to everybody. In addition, as you may know, all of the anadromous fish on the San Joaquin River system have to pass through the South Delta, going out to the ocean and coming back to spawn. And of course, there have been very difficult times in recent years trying to maintain those populations. And so the South Delta is, again, a very important hub for that important ecological system. But again, the South Delta is also great farmland, and it's very fertile ground. My part of the Delta is not peat soil. There's a little peat soil in there, but it's mostly other soils. And it's very fertile, and it's been farmed for over 150 years or more, probably since before the state was a state in the Union. So anyway, with that introduction, the area does suffer from many problems. Most importantly for long-term activities is the flooding problem. And what happens is when we have high flow years, because of snowpack, or sometimes you get a warm storm coming in. We have a high snowpack and then all the water comes down at once. That creates a tremendous problem. And in various occasions, we've had catastrophic flooding. Not really since 1997, but we have had flood risks in high flow years even today. So for too long a time, the area has not been the subject of any project to improve these various aspects of it, or to help it move forward for the future. But we think we now have a project that not only satisfies the initial needs of flood protection and farmers, but it also improves the beneficial uses and helps beneficial users to a tremendous degree. So I'll just, I guess I'll leave it there, because the virtual part of this tour that we've recorded gives a synopsis of the project itself. And after that's done, then I'll expand on some of that. So with that, if we can go to I'll magically appear outside on a levee. In 1997, there were high flows on the San Joaquin River, extraordinary high flows, and that caused serious flooding up and down this area. When that was all over, they did a lot of analysis as to what they could do to decrease the flood risk because of the massive amount of damage that was caused. And a number of issues came up. The first was that upstream dams had not operated to their own flood control manuals, and so they caused excess water to come down at the wrong time. But more importantly, it was discovered that the channels of the South Delta were not holding and safely conveying the designed flood flow amounts. So an idea was developed, and that was to create an intentional area where you would siphon off the high flows in order to lower the stage on the San Joaquin River and prevent further floods. That idea bounced around. There were a lot of proponents, but no entity was interested or took the lead in developing the project. Eventually, American Rivers, in conjunction with RD 2062 and South Delta Water Agency, developed the idea of a permanent flood bypass in order to address this high flow issue. Now, interestingly, the system already had a bypass system, which is called Paradise Cut, and that's where we're standing right now. Paradise Cut was designed to siphon off high flows when the river reached a stage of about 19,000 CFS. That's okay, but that didn't work sufficiently in the 1997 flood just because of the volume of water coming down. So the idea that was developed was to increase the area where water could overflow to decrease the stage on the San Joaquin River. When you decrease the stage, of course, you decrease the risk of flooding. So the idea became, take about 500 acres that's just upstream of the current overflow bypass project and turn that into an area that, upon high flows, it would siphon off the water, and that would be stored temporarily until it made its way safely back down into the system again. So the current system, as I said, has this Paradise Cut weir, and the weir flowed at a certain stage level on the San Joaquin River. The analysis showed that if you increase the size of this weir, you don't get as much bang for your buck as you do if you go upstream and create a new weir, a bigger weir. And that's just because the slope of the land means that down here, a wider weir only siphons up a little more, but one upstream can siphon off a lot. So of course, the specifics of doing this are very complicated. You have to make sure that you don't have downstream impacts. And so the development of the idea and the process included discussions with local reclamation districts so that their plans and their activities are not frustrated by this effort to decrease stage on the river. The important part about the Paradise Cut expansion project is, as configured now, the analysis shows that in a 1997 event, in the location where the new weir would be, the stage of the river would drop by 3 feet. That is tremendously big impact. When you get down to where we are, a few miles up or downstream, the decrease was about 2 feet, and that's also very, very significant. So the analysis concluded that if this project were working, there wouldn't have been any floods in 1997. And so that is so attractive to the local districts that virtually everybody was in support of it. Now, I say virtually everybody because, of course, when you're rerouting water in the system, that means if you're lowering the stage in one place, you're increasing the water in another place. Now, it's not a direct one-to-one relationship between if I take 1 foot here and put it 1 foot there, that doesn't necessarily increase the other place by 1 foot, but it is of concern. So you're putting more water down this Paradise Cut,
And that means more water gets to certain areas faster than it would normally by taking the normal route to the San Joaquin River and then breaking off at Old River and various other aspects of the South Delta. So in that discussion, we tried to come up with something that would satisfy the downstream rec districts. And of course, their concerns are, if you put more water to us, is it going faster? Is it going to eat away levees? Is it higher stage to increase hydrostatic pressure, which would make seepage to the levees? All sorts of things like that. So we've tried to address all those, and we've done that by getting them on board with a larger project, which is the second part of this thing, which I'll address in the next segment.
Thank you for that, John. Just as a reminder for those who maybe joined us after we'd already done some introductions, my name is Krista. I am the RCD administrator for San Joaquin County, and I'll be serving as your moderator. So if you have any questions during this webinar, please submit those to the Q&A box, and then I will make sure that we get those asked of John. I have a couple of questions for you. You referenced that the existing cut is about 500 acres. What's that comparatively to the proposed new piece that we would be utilizing?
Yeah, the existing overflow is the Paradise Cut channel itself, and the 500 acres refers to the land that would be part of the new portion of the project. And it's a little more than 500, but you got to route it around. But so that's a large couple of parcels of land that the water would spread out slowly if our project gets going.
Gotcha. And a definition question for you, Mr. Herrick. Can you describe and explain a weir?
Yes, sorry about that. The water world has all sorts of acronyms and shortened phrases and everything, but a weir, just picture the low part in a levee, an intentional low part in a levee. So you have a levee that prevents the water from coming in. If you cut a little section out of the top of the levee and rock that, then when the water in the channel reaches a certain stage, it'll start flowing over that weir. So it's a controlled portion of a levee to allow water to flow under certain circumstances.
Thank you. And did you have anything else you wanted to add to that segment? I don't see that we have any questions for that piece at the moment.
Yeah, could we put the map up first, and then I'll try to explain
Absolutely.
some more things that I did not originally. So here's a map of the Delta, and it's maybe a little hard to read. It's got the islands' names on it, but basically the South Delta is the southern portion of the map. And you can see from the bottom, going from south to north, is the San Joaquin River, which goes up there near Stockton and kind of turns left. From the north, you can see that there's the Sacramento River coming from north to south, and it flows in there. And then you have all these distributary channels. Some of them are natural, some of them are man-made, and they delineate the various islands in the Delta. The Delta then, being in the interior of the state, it then flows into Suisun Bay, and it goes out to, through the Carquinez Straits and eventually into San Francisco Bay and into the ocean. But that's the basic system right there. I'd like to add some stuff to the presentation that we had just to make things more clear. We talked about getting the land from the current owners, and they've been very cooperative, and they've expressed no doubts. Of course, it always comes down to what the fair market value is and them selling, but they're actually available to both sell the fee interest, which probably won't happen, but the fee interest would be, somebody else taking actual title of the property, or the purchase of an easement for the property for the purposes of this flood overflow. So again, they've been very helpful. They're on board with the project, and we wanted to make sure that when you start, reconfiguring things and having intentional overflows, that the people whose land you're talking about don't get upset, or don't get too far ahead of them. But they've been very helpful. Now, a major part of the project, which I didn't mention because it's not kind of in the title there, is that the land would be maintained in farming. And that's important for a number of reasons. We like to keep the local farming economy going, but it also provides habitat. So because it's overflow, it would be overflow land. You wouldn't plant most permanent crops because they might be damaged or ruined when it was flooded. But that makes hundreds of acres of protected habitat for things like raptors, Swainson's hawk, and other animals like that. And then the existing levee that we would be allowing water to go over and behind, there are plans to increase the habitat along those levees. And so it's certainly not just a flood overflow project, but it has significant habitat aspects to it. Now, the water that would go over the weir in this new proposal would occur about on average, every 12 years. And that's based on prior hydrology. And so when the San Joaquin River reaches 35,000 CFS, that's cubic feet per second, that's when water would start flowing over the weir. So that's when it would be siphoned over that. The original Paradise Cut bypass, which is still in existence, it was designed to take water when the flow was at 19,000 CFS in the river. So the other one wouldn't start operating until the Paradise Cut one has already been operating. Due to siltation in the river, so the river's shallower now, the Paradise Cut weir currently takes water somewhere around 17,000 CFS, and when 17,000 CFS is in the river. The weir that we're talking about is the new weir would be about 1,000 feet. They've modeled other lengths, and that seems to be the sweet spot there for now. And so you can imagine 1,000 feet of the levee being a little lower with rocking on it so it doesn't wash away when the water flows over it. And then that water would spread out over the land, temporarily held there until it's safely routed back into the system. Lastly, I don't know if there are any other questions, but of course, the bottom line is always cost, and there have been numerous cost estimates. Until we get farther in, you never know if those estimates are correct, of course, but it's going to take a couple $1 million probably to get the further evaluations and permitting done. And then because of the land value and all sorts of things and the new levee work, it's going to be a significant amount of money, probably over $100 million. Many studies have been done, especially the modeling. And as I tell everybody, the expression is all modeling is wrong, but some modeling is useful. And I always say all modeling is wrong, all modeling is wrong. But they've done modeling to figure out how much water can go where at what times and what happens. And we will use that as a guide as we go along. It'll support our environmental investigations, and it will be used to make sure that the surrounding parties, everybody who's on board right now, is happy and satisfied that what we're doing will not adversely affect them. So anyway, that's all I have. If there are any questions, I'll turn it back to Krista.
We do have a question. Reiner would like to know, would the planned weir be designed so that sturgeon and salmon can get into and out of the floodplain?
The ultimate design, of course, is not finalized yet, but the high flow events are normally not times when fish would be, the high flow events normally don't put the fish at risk for leaving the channel like that. Now, that's just a general statement. So when you have 35,000 CFS flowing down the San Joaquin River, that water speeds off down straight, and not too many fish would be siphoned off the top of the river because they're not swimming around the top. Again, those are very general statements. Sturgeon, I don't know about, except that I understand that they're generally on the bottom of the channel and wouldn't be at risk. However, it is contemplated and will be designed such that when the weir is working, any fish that do get in there, we will try to manage this and construct it so that it is good habitat, and it could actually be, we call it kind of a resting area for the out-migrating smolts, which is the small salmon or steelhead. The out-migrating smolts to have a safe habitat where they can linger a little bit if they want, and put on some more weight before they start their journey out to the ocean. Remember that this issue is the same that exists with the current weir, and of course Paradise Cut does connect with the other channels in the Delta, and so fish that do get into that area do have the ability to continue downstream and hopefully complete their life cycle.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions at this point, and I think the next piece of our journey, if you will, is going to take us to actually see the land that we may be utilizing in the future and getting some more details. So I think we're ready for that segment.
The land that we're proposing to use as the overflow is right here behind me. And you can see it's a large section. We've talked to the landowners already, and they're willing to sell it. And so there's not going to be any problem with, people recommending eminent domain or anything. We want to make sure everything is done with local support. So we're not at that stage yet, and so they're still farming it. But again, if you go upstream, we're intending to put a big weir in there, which will take those flood flows and spread them out over the land so that they can be slowly released back into the channel being Paradise Cut. Off to this side again is the San Joaquin River coming downstream, flowing south to north. And as it goes upstream, it turns right there. And if you turned left, you would hit the weir we were just talking about. And the weir is the existing bleed off valve for the high flows, and it flows directly into Paradise Cut. So the proposal will end up with actually two weirs, the existing one, and then the new one we're building upstream to siphon off those high flows to make the river stage much lower in those high flood events and hopefully prevent those serious floods.
Appreciate that visual. That certainly helps to kind of demonstrate where we're talking about building a weir, where and where. Does anyone have any questions about that piece? I don't have any questions coming in at this point. John, did you have anything to add about that?
I would just, I think, further clarify the issue of the ownership of the land. Currently, there is an agricultural easement on the property, and that limits development of the property, but it doesn't limit all activities. What we're proposing to do, if it weren't purchased in fee, would be a flood easement that would further limit the agricultural activity. So things like permanent crops wouldn't be allowed. Those two easements are in conflict. So although the landowners are currently, cooperative and have no problem, when the time comes, we would probably have to condemn the existing easement in order to put the new easement, which is more restrictive, because the owners of the beneficiaries of the current easement, would want to be compensated for the lack of ability to put trees or grapevines in there. But anyway, I don't see that as a big deal. We initially were looking to buy the easement outright a few years ago, and we ran into the second easement problem. And so various parties have been involved in trying to negotiate what can be done, and we'll solve that. But again, the important part is that the landowners are on board so that somebody doesn't think that, John Herrick or the South Delta is drawing circles on the land for somebody else to use it for something. So we want to keep it in agriculture, and it will if this goes forward. And we hope that everybody's happy when we get to that stage and and turn the land into an overflow valve.
You are reading my mind. It sounds like bottom line, project or no project, you want to keep the land in agriculture and making sure that happens. So I think everyone can agree that that's a great plan. And we talked a little bit, you kind of touched on siltation and some of the things that's doing to flow and habitat and kind of what that looks like. And I think the next stage and the next visual that we should give our audience is, what does that look like when we say that, we've got some issues? Let's go out and give them a real good visual of kind of what we're talking about.
At the same time that the Paradise Cut expansion project was being developed, we ran into another problem here in the South Delta channels. And that was, I got a phone call a couple Christmases ago, and one of the local diverters said, Mr. Herrick, there's no water in Old River. And I said, well, there's water in Old River, but what's the problem? He says, there's no water in Old River. Get out here. So I drove out there, and just upstream here, there was a diversion off of an oxbow to Old River. And when I got there, the diversion, which is the pump with a pipe down to the water, there was no water at the bottom of the pipe, which meant a major river in the South Delta didn't have water in it. Now, of course, there was a little bit, 20 yards away, there was probably 6 inches of water, but that was certainly insufficient to run any sort of pump. So that began an investigation by South Delta Water Agency, and it turns out that contrary to what we thought before, which is that high flows would move siltation out of the rivers, that's not happening. The siltation was accumulating, and all of our channels are slowly getting more shallow. Now, when you think about that, you'll notice that if the channel doesn't have as much depth anymore, then it holds less water. And that's important for a number of reasons. Not only for flood flow carrying capacity, in other words, how much can the channel take when the high flows are coming down, but also we're in a tidal zone. So when the tide comes in and your channel is more shallow, less water is coming in. So less supply, less dilution for water quality issues. All sorts of problems arise from that. The best way to describe that is, I tell people, we used to have a channel that, say, I'm just making this up, say it's 12 feet deep. If you now have siltation that's 10 feet deep, instead of having a 12-foot deep channel, you've got a 2-foot deep channel. So the volume of water passing through that now is significantly less. And although I just made those numbers up, those are very close to numbers we have at a couple places in the South Delta where the degradation due to siltation has just turned the channel into a shallow, warm water, insufficient flow, mess. Now that shallow, warm water also encourages the growth of foreign invasive species such as Egeria and hyacinth. It also creates HABs, which are those algae blooms that cause toxic impacts to various plants and animals. It's just a whole slew of problems. But again, the supply issue was the one that came home first, and that is when you have a pump on the river and there's not enough water for the pump to operate, your operation comes to a standstill. So we tried to get other people's support. There was a little argument at first about was somebody responsible for this or not, and whose duty was to dredge the rivers, all those things we went through. But at the very end, we got a diverse group of interests together who thought that the idea of cleaning the channels up was very important. And that group included not just the South Delta interests, but also export interests. And the reason that's important is the South Delta and the export interests are previously in conflict over a number of issues because the export projects of the state and federal governments are in the South Delta, and those have certain effects that cause these frictions. But anyway, so the South Delta Water Agency, the state water contractors, San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, Westlands Water District, the State Water Resources Control Board Water Master's Office, the Department of Water Resources, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation all got together and had a number of meetings, raised some money amongst themselves, and paid for a consultant to outline and provide a guide to what dredging might be done in the South Delta. We think that this is not only a good necessary step, but it's vital to the further agricultural health of the area. There are certain areas here where even during summer months when irrigation is at the highest, we have very low water levels, and I get calls that say, John, I can't irrigate. There's not enough water in the river. So it's very, very important. Now, how does this fit together with the Paradise Cut expansion project? Well, remember I said that almost everybody was in favor of it, but of course the downstream people had concerns because the Paradise Cut expansion project was going to transfer more water to their area during high flows. And so the discussions ensued, and those were that if we could get some sort of dredging project, that would increase the channel depth, that would help protect them during high flows, and all of that dredge material can be used either for levee support or we would trade it for rocks for levee protection, stuff like that. So everybody eventually agreed that if you combine the two projects, you have something that everybody can support. And that's what we've done now. We've combined the two projects into the horribly long named Paradise Cut Expansion South Delta Restoration Project. Now, I want you to get a feel for the problem here. You can see behind me is one of the channels of Old River, and it winds its way through the South Delta. It provides some of the best looking areas because of the oak trees and the brush and the various natural habitats along the river. But if you look a little farther downstream here, you can see the side of the channel is dry, sandy silt. And that is very bad because that inhibits the flow of the river. It decreases the volume of water that can be in the river, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. If you picture that dry, moist sand there that you can see coming all the way across the channel, that's what I saw that December when that guy called me about not being able to divert. So this part of the project, of course, we think needs to occur first. We have to go through all the analyses and the environmental review. But if we do the dredging first so that the downstream areas can safely hold enough water, then the Paradise Cut expansion project can go forward and the two will fit together nicely and everybody will be happy and everybody will support it. And when I say everybody will support it, there are approximately, I think there's 17 reclamation districts within the South Delta. We've already got the vast majority of them to sign an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the new lead agency for the project for it to go forward and that they support it. So that's a very big step. The ones that haven't signed it yet have told me they're going to. They just haven't gotten to the process yet.
Thank you for that. I think that visual really helps. And if I'm not mistaken, we have a couple of other visuals. And while we load that, maybe Mr. Herrick, you could explain what happened to the gentleman who was unable to irrigate that day in the story that you were telling us.
Yeah, you hear these stories and it's kind of like, okay, that's one of the problems that people face. But it comes home when you actually meet the guy, and he was trying to pre-irrigate for winter wheat. And sometimes you luck out and the winter is wet enough so you don't have to irrigate for the wheat to grow. And other times you have to irrigate because there's been no rain. So I went out there, and he was kind of at a junction there. He didn't know what to do because he had already planted the wheat. Excuse me. He was getting ready to do the pre-irrigation to plant the wheat, and the diversion was simply unusable. He could not get any water. So he actually lost that crop. He was a tenant. I don't know how much he owed his landlord for rent, but he probably still owed him some rent, but he got zero crop for that. So it's very important to understand the extent of the problem that we're facing here in the South Delta. Now, the next picture we have available is of that actual diversion point. And we just didn't put it in the video because that's on private property, and I didn't contact the guy to drive on there. But as you can see, I may have overstated the emptiness of the river, but the channel over there on the right, that's about, like I said, 6 inches deep. And so the hole around the base of the intake of the pump, which is that pipe there on the left, that water was flowing through a little teeny channel towards the river. There was no water flowing towards the pump. So if he turned his pump on, in about 2 seconds, it would immediately start sucking air and would shut off, besides pulling in sand and other things that ruin it. So this is a very, very important aspect of the issue here. And that is whether or not we try to prevent future floods by having an overflow area. That almost becomes moot if the local area can't irrigate and support the project itself. So let me just expand on that a little bit. And we've run into this in numerous areas in the South Delta where we have shoals that start, and then a year later, they're a small little island. We have blockages in channels so that water can't flow. And those are tremendous things. We got one district, Pescadero Reclamation District, that every year for the past, 20 years at least, except for a couple of those high flow years, they go through the summer turning off either some or most, if not all, of their pumps that provides the district, which is about 6,000 acres, with water. And so, of course, when they can't irrigate when they need to, that adversely affects crops, and they've had a rough time. Now, the reason that we've concluded that they're having that problem is that the channels that feed the channel that they divert from have silted up. So like I said in the video part of this, instead of having a 10-foot deep channel or a 15-foot deep channel that has that volume of water flowing in on the high tide, they've got places where it's a foot or less. And so, anywhere from 1/10 to, 1/3 of the water is flowing towards them. So if they still have the same irrigation needs, but the supply reaching them is much less, then it's a horrible, horrible situation. And so we've had damages, and I don't mean that in a legal term, but damages over, many, many years where people can't do it. I've got other pictures what I'll get to, but if we can put this map up here, the two maps on the screen. And this is just kind of give you an idea of the two halves of the project. On the left is the outline of the Paradise Cut expansion portion. And you can see the shaded area is, I'm colorblind, so I apologize for this, but the shaded area at the bottom of that map on the left is the flood overflow area. And then it's routed down to the other shaded area, which is the current and or to be expanded portions of Paradise Cut, where it can flow then into, and I'm not trying to confuse you with all the things, but it flows into Old River and Grant Line Canal, which have a larger carrying capacity except for their siltation. So that shows you what the project kind of looks like from the air. If you go to the left, if you go to the right map, that's the map that was produced as part of the dredging or the restoration project in the South Delta. And the highlighted parts of the channels there are where we would like to dredge, where we intend to dredge. And so moving from the top to the bottom, the first thing you encounter is Middle River there. So we have substantially large area of Middle River that we need to dredge. And then most of the line that goes at the bottom from left to right and then goes up on the left side, that's Old River, and that needs to be dredged too. Now, before I move on, let me just say that there are other areas that need to be dredged. We originally mentioned the San Joaquin River, which is where we want to bleed off the water during high flows. There are portions of the San Joaquin River that are indeed 10 feet less deep now because of siltation. San Joaquin River hasn't been dredged in my lifetime that I know of. So it's 30 years, sorry. So, it's 60 years or more. And that creates quite a problem. The San Joaquin River from Vernalis north, which is downstream, is supposed to carry 52,000 CFS safely. That's what it was designed for. The last time we had high flows, which was 2017, at 31,000 CFS, we started having significant seepage issues along the river. And that's because the river now carries, half of what it used to carry. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the water's overtopping the levees, although we came close in some areas, but that, a shallower channel carries less water and the water has to go somewhere. So the water starts pushing, laterally, and that's what causes seepage. But if you can imagine that's a major, one of the two major rivers of California, now can safely hold, somewhere around a half of what it used to hold. So depending on what climate change results in, they have expectations of huge flows on the San Joaquin River under certain circumstances. And you simply can't have towns or farming anywhere near a river that can't carry what you expect will come down in high flow times. So with that, we have some other pictures. I don't know if we were going to do them now, but if we could bring up the Undine Bridge picture, please. And this is one of the other areas of the of Middle River that I was talking about. And I don't know if you can see it too well. Those vertical lines in the top there, that's another pump platform. And you can see from this picture that the water, and I went out and walked in the water this day, the water is literally 6 inches deep. And those colored areas in the middle of the channel there, that's both plants growing, but also it's little sandbars sticking out of the water. So the volume of that is, for all practical purposes, zero. And that means everybody along that stretch who needs to irrigate, if they need to irrigate, simply cannot do it. And that's a tremendously significant problem. Now, this bleeds over into other areas too. As part of the operation of the Delta by the Department of Water Resources and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, they do regular modeling to predict, what flows will be where, what quality will be where. And that's part of their obligations under their permits to operate their projects. So the main model, the computer model that they use in the South Delta for these sort of issues is called DSM-2. And that model is just a set of computer calculations that has pre-existing inputs. And the inputs are things like how wide is the channel, which direction does the water come from initially, how deep is the channel? Well, we've run into problems over the years with the modeling, and this is not to slam or slight the modelers or anything, but we've run into problems where the model is run and it's used as a guide. We think these are the conditions, so we can therefore do this. Well, the model results at sometimes are really out of whack, and they don't match measuring devices that are in the Delta. And so we've had significant discussions and large arguments periodically about the effects of that. Well, when we got into it in a set of hearings that occurred a few years ago, we start looking at the model assumptions. And the last picture I showed you that showed the shallow channel there, during those circumstances, the model thinks the channel is 10 feet deep. And the channel used to be 10 feet deep because it used to not have the silt in it, but now it's not 10 feet deep. So the model that is trying to analyze and predict, and there's an issue about predicting, I won't get into that, but that's trying to analyze and predict how much water flows through Middle River to where, and where does it end up, and what is the water quality. It thinks there's, whatever that is, 10 times or 30 times more water in there than there actually is. So if you have a model that's predicting the water quality somewhere in the area, and it thinks that there's a channel that has, I'm making up the number, 50 CFS flowing through it, but it only has 5 CFS flowing through it, then you've got a serious, serious problem. So the dredging portion of the project doesn't, of course, cure the modeling, but we're working separately with the Department of Water Resources so that we're going to do regular soundings, which is monitoring the depth of the channels, and update the modeling so it can be more accurate, while at the same time have our co-goal of eventually dredging it so that we can have channels that provide the necessary flow and dilution. That flow and dilution is not just for humans, and it's not just for diversions. You can see from looking at that picture that if you're a fish, whether you're trying to migrate or whether you live there, that's not habitat. And you can't expect there to be healthy ecosystems in an area that has extremely shallow water, because in summer, of course, that shallow water heats up, becomes terrible habitat. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll take those, but I have some other things I'd like to mention if there aren't any.
We do have some questions for you. We have some eager beavers, if you will. So Reiner has a question. It says, was the siltation caused primarily by the lack of sufficient flow from the Merced, Tuolumne, and Stanislaus tributaries to move the sediment out? And how often does the San Joaquin River channels and sloughs how often will they be dredged? Do the upstream diverters help pay for that?
Obviously, those are good questions. The use of water by humans over the past 150 years certainly results in decreases of flows at certain times in certain places. Now, we all consume water. Ag consumes water. Cities consume water. South Delta and the Bureau did a report back in 1980. It needs to be updated, of course, but back in 1980, and estimated the amount of decrease in flow in the river due to upstream development, including the federal project. You can say that the decrease in flows on those rivers could be a contributing factor to the siltation problem in the South Delta, but for the most part, to my understanding, most of the silt comes down when there's high flows because it's activating the channels, picking up silt along the way and moving it down. So most of the volume, the total load of silt comes in on the higher flows. And whether or not upstream uses or dams have decreased those high flows, I think the fact that they prevent periodic or regular flooding is better than their impact on those high flows. So anyway, the water comes down in South Delta. Now, as you all know, the Delta is tidal. And so when the water's rushing down the streams because there's high flows, the silt goes with it and doesn't drop out too much. But as soon as you hit the South Delta, you're in a tidal area. So there's a huge volume of water that sloshes in and out twice a day. And that sloshing slows down the rate at which the water exits the system. And so that's where that's where all the silt will settle out. And that's why we have the problem. I don't know enough about the historic conditions in the South Delta to tell you that high flows back in, say, the 60s kept the channels from silting up or not. But the historic surveys done starting back in the 20s and through today, those indicate that the channels continuously slowly degrade. So I don't think the problem can be laid at the doorstep of the upstream diverters, but certainly it's part of the entire scenario of what's happening here. Now, the second part of the question was, I forgot.
It's okay. I can help you out there. How often do the San Joaquin River channels and sloughs be dredged? And then do the upstream diverters help pay for that?
Yes. Now, as soon as you start talking about dredging, the local farmers, give me the stink eye and say, well, you dredge it once, it's just going to fill up again. So what's your plan? So yes, we haven't solved all the problems, but the dredging program that we've outlined is going to include some sort of maintenance dredging. Now, how you do that and who pays for it, that's unknown right now. But the initial dredging will result in substantially large benefits. And then, of course, it'll slowly degrade over time. So there are certain things that can be done. And one of those is called a silt trap. And again, this is not a commitment by anybody because we haven't analyzed what the ecological effects or environmental effects are on doing these things. But a silt trap is you take a section of the river and you make a deep hole there. You dig it out a little bit. And then when the waters come down with all the silt will settle out in those areas. So you just have to dredge or suction out that area rather than large areas. And so that can work. So maybe 2 or 3 of those at certain locations would be significant help. Or, and again, it's all according to the engineering eventually and the permitting. My idea for the Delta is that we would have both state and federal legislation that creates some sort of Delta maintenance dredging program, so that there's always dredger working, and we do it at the pace where we keep everything at some acceptable level. Now, of course, the cost is always the issue. At this point, we have heard those concerns from other people, but we've not anticipated seeking direct funding from people upstream or downstream or anybody else. But we are trying to figure out if we can get, as I said, if there's legislation that creates a program, then it may have sufficient funding to cover it all, or local people may have to put up money, and we find money from other places too. But it is a big problem in order to make sure that we don't do this one time and then have it slowly go away, and then 25 years from now somebody else has to face the same problem.
Thank you. Bruce, I see your question, but I'm going to hold off on that because we're going to answer it in another segment, and then I'll re-ask that for you. Miss Molly has a question. It says, so is the silt you remove good for anything, growing crops, question mark? So maybe you can talk to kind of the quality of the dredging spoils, as you call it.
That's like a plant. Like I plan to do that because that's one of the topics I've written down to cover here. Again, when we started this discussion, there was a lot of concern from everybody, including me, that, okay, well, what's in the silt? Because the regulators, when they issue permits, they really don't want you to mobilize the silt and potentially cause problems, not just for turbidity, which is one of their issues, but also what's in it. Does this going to cause further problems for the ecosystem? So I convinced the South Delta board to spend a big chunk of money. And I guess it's maybe 2 years ago now already. We selected certain areas, and we hired a contractor who went out and shoved a pipe down on the silt and took samples at various levels. And we took those samples and sent them to the lab, and they analyzed them. And I say amazingly, but maybe it's not, but we didn't find any pesticides or herbicides. Now, that comes as a surprise, and I'm not saying that there can't be or aren't any pesticides and herbicide remnants in the channels, but that's a big deal, that it looked like it was all pretty clean. And so the only abnormality, I'll say, was there were some amounts of heavy metals, excuse me, but not really in any amounts that would preclude dredging. And the contractor for South Delta who was doing this, and our engineer who was analyzing it, they said to me, John, is there some chromium steel factory upstream? Because they found chromium. So we don't know what that's all about. We don't know if that's going to be a problem or not. But it was only those kind of a few heavy metals that raised an eyebrow or something. So what do you do with the silt? There are a number of proposals. My initial idea was to, okay, if we're going to get 1 million, 2 million cubic yards of silt, what do we do with it? Well, the first thing is levee work. The various reclamation districts in the Delta rely only on assessments, generally only on assessments from their landowners. So as you might imagine, they're not flush with funds typically. There is a state program that helps pay for a good portion of projects, but that's a slow process, and it doesn't mean anybody can afford it even with that help. But say we get a few million cubic yards of silt. So areas that need levee work, you wouldn't put the silt, the fine grain stuff, on the water side because it's fine grain, it might wash away. But if you put the silt on the spoils on the land side, you create weight on the levee, which both prevents seepage and stabilizes the levee itself. And they've done tremendous work with that sort of activity on Jones Track. And you drive by or on those levees, and they have nice wide levees, and they've got a huge berm of the levee on the land side, and those levees aren't going to break. Now, of course, anything can happen, but that's really good. So that's the first use of that siltation, that removed silt that we were planning on having. The second thing, and I've already contacted local sand and rock companies, and I said, look, if I have an extra 1,000,000 cubic yards of silt, that has a value, doesn't it? And would I be able to, trade it to you guys or other people for rock? And the immediate answer from everyone was, sure, we'll take that because somebody else is going to dig it up, and we can figure that out. So that second idea was that if you can't use the dredge spoils, the silt in some place, you might be able to trade it for rock, and rock is what the rec districts love. Now, there's always an issue of maintaining habitat, which we'll get to in a little bit, but people that are behind levees love to have rock on the outside of levees so high flows don't wash the levee away, and the people on the land side of the levee don't start floating. So that's another idea. However, as we went through this project, we also learned that there are various areas in the delta and bays downstream of us who are eager for this sort of silt. So there are places in San Francisco Bay where they want to dump this to fill in holes. There are places like Frank's Track, which is an island that flooded many, many years ago and has remained flooded. And it's horrible habitat right now. And they're talking about, filling it in or filling in parts of it. There are projects like that that want this sort of dredge spoil. And so there are all sorts of opportunities. It translates into removing it from here, moving it over somewhere else where there's a good benefit that's derived. So it's all sorts of stuff. So it all kind of comes together and helps everybody if we can get this going. Now we'll get to the fishery ecological aspects here in a minute, but I just want everybody to appreciate that, the initial reaction is, oh my goodness, you want to take that much dirt out? And we say, yeah, and look at all the good we're going to do with it. So again, we'll get to the ecological parts in a minute, but I think that's it for that answer. Let's see if I forgot something here.
Okay. Do you have anything else? Oh,
I do have one more thing.
Okay.
Now, as you might imagine, if you're going to do this big dredging project in the South Delta, it's not just a question of getting a dredge and doing it, because right now, everybody is adjusted to how the water flows under high flow events. So the water comes up the San Joaquin River, which is downstream, and then it goes, the river goes straight to Stockton-ish, and halfway up there, it turns into Old River, and Old River goes down like this and around the Delta, and off of Old River comes Middle River, and then off of Old River, there's a Grant Line Canal. All three of those then meet over here as the water flows out. So if you have a high flow event right now, everybody is adjusted, so to speak, to how much water will be going down to what channel. So if you dredge one channel and you haven't dredged the other ones, you reroute the high flows. And so you could end up with people being extremely upset with you. In addition, if you start dredging on the upstream end of a section, you encourage more flow to go in one direction, and the people are all upset with you. So the specifics of the dredging, and we've talked about this, but we haven't resolved it yet, are you have to start from the downstream most point, and you have to move upstream, and you may not be able to dredge as deep as you want initially because of timing issues and those flow issues. So if you're dredging from the bottom of Old River up and the bottom of Middle River up, and you stop in, say, October because of permitting issues, then you have a high flow, is that going to change how much water goes in what direction? And so we have to make sure that we do it in a logical, safe manner that doesn't mess with the current hydrodynamics of the system. Sorry.
Awesome. Thank you. So clearly this is a multifaceted project, and we've kind of talked about a couple of those. One thing that we maybe haven't talked about just yet is who's going to kind of lead the charge, and where are we, and who's going to take it to that next step, and kind of what does that dynamic look like? So I think we have a segment for you guys to kind of chat about that for a minute.
Now, I've described to you the wonderful projects as we see them that we need to get done, and we are going to get done. But the question's always arisen from the very beginning, and that is, who's going to be the project lead or the project sponsor? We're talking about multi-million-dollar project here, and so it's very difficult for any local reclamation district that has a limited budget to take the lead. The cities, although some of the surrounding cities get a benefit from this, they have their own plans for trying to meet flood protection goals. And who is left? Well, that leaves the South Delta Water Agency, except the South Delta Water Agency, notwithstanding its wonderful name, is a sort of a one-man operation. We have a limited budget. We can't raise money unless we have a Proposition 218 election. We suffer from the same thing as most small agencies, and that is insufficient funds. So everybody, and by that I mean all the local attorneys for the rec districts and their engineers, we all got together and tried to figure out who would be the best lead agency for this. Fortunately, San Joaquin County has an agency called the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency, or shorthand is SJCRCD. And that agency is charged with certain levee protection and levee work, flood control protection in portions of San Joaquin County, especially the city of Stockton, Lathrop, Manteca, and the areas around the San Joaquin River near those cities. So we approached SJCRCD, and they were willing and excited to be involved in something like that. And so we went through various sort of negotiations and outlines of what needs to happen. And eventually the SJCRCD board agreed to become the lead for the project. Now, when I say lead, there are legal terms that interfere with me using regular language. A lead for a project is an actual project, and they're responsible for environmental work. What we're talking about is somebody to move this project forward so that it reaches that stage. So SJCRCD may not be the eventual entity that's actually getting the construction of the project done, but they're willing to take over the investigations. The good news is for them is that immediately the Department of Water Resources started talking to us, and they were very positive in finding grant monies to help us further the project along and see how far we can go. That's very encouraging. We hope to get about $3 million this June to advance the project. Separately from that, the State Water Contractors has approached us, and they're trying to get a line item in this year's budget, California budget, to provide significant support for the dredging portion of this project. So although the dredging is a big deal and the Paradise Cut expansion is a big deal, things look pretty good, and we hope to move forward and eventually get it all done.
So that answers a little bit of the question as to how we move forward from here. John, do you have anything to add to that segment?
I think I would just add that my thanks and compliments to SJCRCD. When somebody comes up and says, "I got this great big project, you want to do it," you might assume that they'd say, "Whoa, wait a minute." But SJCRCD has been very positive and very helpful from the very beginning. The board members, the couple of them I've talked to along the way, were very, very sympathetic. The idea of this area-wide interest appeals to everybody. And so not only does everybody benefited, but the multi-benefits of the project for other uses, not just humans, just made it really, really attractive. So SJCRCD, which hasn't undertaken this large of a project in our area of this county, was very helpful and very good. We had some long negotiations with their attorney about what that memorandum of understanding I was talking about would say, because we wanted to make sure that the dredging portion is completed first before that additional water from the Paradise Cut expansion portion reaches the area. So everybody was very cooperative and helpful, and we think we've made a lot of progress. Integral to this, though, of course, is that the local rec districts need to be both part of it and in support of it. And so part of that MOU that we worked out that the districts have all signed creates an advisory committee to SJCRCD as we move forward on this further investigation or advancement of the project. And that advisory committee will have representatives of especially the downstream rec districts, and of course the rec district where the overflow would be, and other interested parties, which are just about everybody. But so it looks good. We're in the process now of constituting that committee. We want to make sure everybody that wants to can attend. And then we reach the issue of, okay, who's going to attend from those districts? Well, for the most part, without seeming to insult Reclamation District Board of Directors, the person that to be on that advisory committee, of course, would be their engineer. And because the engineer is more fluent with the hydrodynamics, the specifics of each district's needs, future plans that they have for improvements of levees, things like that. But that costs money, right? So as I said, most rec districts aren't overly flush with funds. Getting 5 or 10 engineers, it wouldn't be that many, but number of engineers or their attorneys involved in a committee like that that provides some sort of strain on them. So we're going to try to see what we can do to defer some of those costs. I'm not prejudging anything or giving away South Delta's money, but the idea originally was, well, let's see if South Delta could help pay, or some other funds help pay for the time of those engineers or attorneys on that advisory committee. Just to put a final lid on that issue, when SJCRCD was considering whether or not to take this over, one of their board members said, "Mr. Herrick," he says, "so you're looking for us to pay for your project, huh?" I said, no, we're going to find the money. And I said, for your staff time, we're going to try to raise money to help. I don't know what that's going to cost, or I don't know how much I can raise. And so we've committed to try to do that. And I can tell you that next day or two here, I'm going to be setting up a meeting with a local Joint Powers Authority, which includes the South Delta and River Islands. And we've got money in there for these kind of things. And we're going to see if we can authorize some contribution to SJCRCD for their staff time. Because remember, the grant money's not in yet. And so anytime that their staff people are working on this project, the money has to come from somewhere. So true to our hopeful commitment, we're going to try to make sure that we're not just shifting burdens to other people, but we're getting it paid for and everybody's happy.
Thank you. So just to kind of summarize, we've talked about, the flood control component. We've talked about some dredging and some siltation issues that we've had. Who's going to potentially lead this project forward? Obviously, as Mr. Herrick said, now what's the ecological side and the mitigation and helping some of our wildlife and doing some of those aspects. So I think we're going to take you out and show you kind of some of those issues and then talk about ways to improve them.
Now, of course, a big project like this is going to require significant mitigation. So we're trying to approach that in a number of ways. The first is, when you have miles and miles of shallow river that's only this deep, our argument is that's no longer shallow water habitat for fish. It's bad habitat. It's not habitat at all. And in our discussions with Fish and Wildlife personnel, they agree with us. So we think reestablishing the depth and miles of channel will create a tremendous benefit for the local fish, as well as the ones that migrate back and forth through the delta. But in addition to that, we've got all sorts of other plans. When you look across the channel here, this is Dowdy Cut. And by the way, you can see in Dowdy Cut, it's completely clogged here with dying hyacinth. And you can also see in the middle of the channel, you can see grass growing on dirt. That shows you right there that this channel allows virtually no water to pass through it. And so when the tide comes in, a little bit may squeeze through, but that's nowhere near enough to supply the diversions in the area. But anyway, you look at this island across from us, and I've talked to the owners, so I'm not trying to get too far ahead of working with people, but they're open to an eventual sale of that property. Now, of course, that's subject to negotiating terms of price and all sorts of things like that. But if you take that island and we're doing significant dredging, you can put the dredge spoils on the island either temporarily or permanently. And if the project can purchase that island, we can turn that into any habitat that Fish and Wildlife Service and Fish and Wildlife Department of Fish and Wildlife want. And that means you could put channels through there so it's shallow water. You could build mounds to protect riparian brush rabbits when the floodwaters come through. You can do all sorts of things with that land. We're not just looking at this one island. There are lots of little islands, especially in Old River, that are unprotected, and they're wonderful habitat. But when you have high flow times, those islands slowly degrade, and so less and less land mass is there. They may move it downstream, but that's just silt now. It's not an island for habitat. We've also got a few stretches of tremendously overgrown areas right on the water, but they're full of blackberries and other stuff. And it to me anyway, it's horrible looking habitat, and we're contacting people that construct and renovate habitat to see what we can do for those. So we've got all sorts of plans to not only mitigate what we're going to do, but also to show how what we're doing in and of itself is of tremendous benefit. And I have to tell you that the Department of Fish and Wildlife people that I've talked to, they're actually excited that somebody's proposing new habitat in the South Delta because it's been neglected for so many years, and everybody just assumes that the fish that get here all eventually die. So we're looking to make things a lot better, not just for farmers, but for cities, from flood control, for habitat, for river access, for recreation, for boating. we think this is a project that everybody will support.
Thank you, Mr. Herrick. So I'm going to start off with Bruce's question because it's been in for a while, and then any other comments you'd like to provide. It says, could you speak to the impact on fish and wildlife and whether those interests can support this as well?
That's actually the nub of the issue here, and that is when you're proposing this tremendously large dredging project, can it ever be permitted? Well, the initial discussions were, a lot of people saying, no, you can't get that done. But then we started to apply logic to it, and we started talking to fish and wildlife representatives. Now, over the years, I've been doing this for so long that we've had thousands of hearings and, arguments with all sorts of people in front of the state board and other forums. And so over the years, you develop relationships with certain people. And so two of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife personnel came out at my invitation, and we went to various spots here, and I showed them these areas. And they're the ones that make comments too for the eventual permitting by the regional board. And, there are all sorts of things involved with their responsibilities to make sure that what's done is not adverse or supposed to not be adverse. So when I took them to Middle River, we showed you pictures of that earlier. And I said, now look, you can see that. And I said, is that shallow water habitat? And of course, we're friendly and everything. So they looked at me and says, no, that's not. And so I'm not trying to hold anybody to anything. They didn't make any commitment to me. But when you look down Middle River there, which is what that picture is, and you say, is that habitat for fish? The answer really is no. In fact, the day I took that picture, some guy came walking up the middle of the river. And I said, what's going on? He says, my boat got stuck and I'm trying to get back to my car. So I said, well, did you find any fish? He says, there aren't any fish in this river. He was he was kind of upset. But so again, this may be more of a problem than I anticipate. But if you're actually analyzing the proposal to dredge these channels, you're not adversely affecting fish in the long term. You might adversely affect fish in the short term because there are fish in places. But if you're reestablishing healthy ecosystems by dredging the channel, so you don't have warm water, you don't have shallow water, you've got all sorts of things that are alive in there that provide food for fish, you've got habitats so they can hide and all sorts of things, you're improving it. This is a benefit. So the initial discussion is going to be from our side is, you don't want us to mitigate because that's what we're doing. We're mitigating for all the sins of the past. And so we don't need to mitigate dredging this. We're creating the habitat that you want. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, of course, we're not going to get a permit that says, John Herrick, you're wonderful and you've got such clever ideas that you don't have to do any mitigation. So we're gonna do all these other things too. And those other things are really comprehensive in my view. And that's not because we're trying to satisfy somebody. That's because we think analyzing the project either will result in this or requires this. So I mentioned a few things in that video portion there. Well, the island that we were looking at, on the other side of that island, there's a channel called Salmon Slough. And Salmon Slough is the worst shallow, clogged remnants of meth lab, messed up channel that you could imagine. I mean, it's a mess. And the only time that water goes through it is when we have flood events and it comes rushing through there. And of course, because it's all clogged, that causes the water to move in all sorts of weird directions and erodes everything along the edges. That should be habitat. And so our project is going to provide for the reestablishment of that as habitat. Now, it is habitat now, but it's habitat for rats, and I guess coyotes eating the rats or something, but it's not water habitat. It's not fish habitat. It's not riverine habitat. It's a clogged mess. And so reestablishing that should be mitigation for what they want to do. We have all sorts of opportunities like that. I don't want to overstate it, but there are areas that we can do all these tremendous things. Now, as part of the dredging program, again, remember we said we were going to try to help the local RDs use the silt either for landside support for the levees or perhaps trade for rock. Well, the rec districts, when they do their long-term levee improvement, because they'll be obligated to under not just common sense and protecting the land, but under global or excuse me, climate change, protocols, they're going to have to do mitigation because they're doing in water work. So let's put all of this together so that whatever the immediate impacts are, which we'll try to minimize, of course, we'll be obligated to, and we'll try to mitigate them, not just minimize them, but looking at the whole when we're done, it's going to be a net increase in habitat. And so we think this is, not just let's protect us, but it improves everything. Now go back to that channel we were talking about, looking at, which was, no feet deep, let's say, and say, okay, what's the opportunity for boaters or fishermen? There's zero, right? I mean, it's zero. You can't drive a boat down portions of Middle River and Old River or Dowdy Cut in many times of the year. You can't. Don't we want to have the public's participation in this so that they can benefit also? So of course. So when you add it all up, you improve fish habitat, you improve access for boaters and fishers, you improve the levees, you prevent future flood events, you allow continued irrigation of farmland, which is part of the economy of the area. You just improve every beneficial use, especially the environmental ones, because rather than having this place silt up and become, tules and unusable by almost everybody and impassable for anadromous fish, we create a nice area that supports all these beneficial uses. So we think we're on the right track. Again, permitting, money, there's all sorts of problems that are ahead of us. But, I haven't found anybody who disagrees with the benefits that we think will result from what we plan to do. So we'll see.
Well, to call this project multifaceted would be a severe understatement. So I'm going to give everyone one last chance to submit some questions. I know it takes a second to type them out, so I'm going to do some housekeeping really quick. But this is kind of your last call for questions. So I just want to thank the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy for helping support this webinar. It was made possible by them and the Water Quality Supply and Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014. Of course, Mr. Herrick, thank you for your wisdom, your passion, being an excellent tour guide, top notch. If you need a 5-star Yelp recommendation, you just let me know. I'm going to pass it back to you for any other comments, questions. Thank you to our audience for being here. We certainly appreciate that. This is your last call for questions. And Mr. Herrick, if there's any closing statements you would like to make, the floor is yours.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody, especially you, Krista, for putting this all together. The technical people, which you can't see, but I just met virtually yesterday. That's all very helpful. Of course, as you said, the money for this originally came from the Delta Conservancy, and we appreciate that, those grants. We've had 2 grants along the way. I think the takeaway from this is that, the water world constantly fights each other. There's all sorts of problems. When we have droughts, it's just a mess with people fighting and the huge economic impacts to the people that don't get water. That's unfortunately the state of affairs. This, however, I think is a project that I think everybody can support, because we're not asking anybody to do it because it's their responsibility, or we're not asking people to, give up their interests. We think that the project will actually improve every facet of the South Delta and be beneficial for all users. So you can always route your names through Krista. Periodically, we put on a tour in the South Delta, and we never know how many people might want to go or not. So I'm not telling you I'll have a tour in the next week or anything, but you can always say, hey, next time you have a tour, keep me in mind, and we'll take you out there and I'll give you the 10-hour lecture of the problems I face in life. But thank you, everybody, for participating. Again, thank you to the RCD and Krista for getting this all done. The RCD has been key as one of the 2 entities that really kept this going, the other being American Rivers. And again, a shout out to the American Rivers people who, were very open-minded and agreeable when I started talking about this huge project that would dredge also. So I appreciate all that help. And with that, thank you, everybody. And sorry I didn't take up 2 hours of your time.
I do have a couple of compliments for you that I want to pass along since they will go away. Rainer says, thank you for an excellent presentation and your commitment to making this project work. Gary says, thank you. This was very informative. And Molly Watkins says, thank you. So again, like John said, thank you so much to the RCD, for the Conservancy, for everyone who's been a part of this. We certainly appreciate it and your attendance, and we wish you a great rest of your day.